Somewhere in the early quiet of your life, long before the world knew what to call you, your presence already disrupted the pattern. Not because you were loud, but because your silence echoed truths no one else could face. You weren't misunderstood. You were misread by eyes too dim to perceive the intensity of your clarity. What you carried couldn't be boxed, so they tried to fold you into corners that didn't fit. Not out of malice, but fear. They hoped to dilute what was always destined to overflow. But in trying to shrink you, they awakened the very force they feared. A spirit that can't be domesticated, a mind that won't be caged, and a purpose that bends rules into relics. No one announced it. No spotlight swung in your direction. But something shifted quietly when you stopped asking for space and started occupying it. The world didn't crumble, it recalibrated. The framework that once rejected your rhythm has begun to move in time with your steps. The blueprint was never broken, it was just incomplete without your presence. What was once labeled too much, too wild, too intense, has become the very frequency that draws the future in. Those who once stood at the center are now disoriented, because the axis moved, and it moved toward you. They were so busy trying to eclipse your shine, they never noticed the source of the light wasn't external. It was never something you were given. It was something you are. And now, that inner voltage is radiating beyond containment. Every attempt to box you in only charged your expansion. Every sidestep you took around their systems turned out to be the foundation of a path no one else saw coming. Now they're watching, wide-eyed, as the world starts taking its cues from the rhythm you didn't even know you were setting. They thought they were correcting you, adjusting your aim, guiding you toward what was better. But behind their calm advice and practical warnings was a silent campaign to smother what they couldn't understand. Not with harshness, but with polished smiles and carefully chosen words that made you second-guess your instincts. The ones meant to protect you became the first to chip away at the parts of you that made sense before language even entered the picture. They didn't call it fear, they called it love. They didn't call it suppression, they called it structure. What looked like concern was often just their discomfort wearing a gentle voice. But the parts of you they tried to edit? They remembered. They waited. And now, they're rising, untouched by time, untouched by shame. This wasn't about learning, it was always about recovering. Not skills, but memory. Beneath the noise of childhood routines and grown-up expectations, something in you kept humming, low and constant, like a code waiting to be decoded. They tried to overlay it with rules, with shame, with distraction. But those very attempts became the friction that reignited what they hoped would dim. Doubt didn't delete your wisdom, it distilled it. And when the moment came, that truth didn't whisper. It erupted. They weren't random. The ones you fell for had rehearsed this across lifetimes. With careful timing, they entered like magnets wrapped in fantasy, only to unravel like riddles. They mirrored your blind spots with uncanny precision, feeding the very wounds they claimed to heal. The script played out so many times it began to echo. Intense beginnings, confused middles, hollow endings. They didn't reject you. They simply couldn't hold what they came to awaken. And in that cycle, you finally saw it. It was never about their love. It was about your return. They laughed with you, sat beside you, praised your insight like it was a shared language. And yet, when your own storms arrived, their signals grew faint. Their ears, once open for hours, suddenly filled with static when your heart began to speak. They'd mastered the art of leaning on you, extracting comfort, absorbing clarity, feeding off your grounding presence. But when your walls cracked, they tiptoed back into the shadows. It was never mutual, only familiar. A silent contract where you carried the weight, and they kept their hands clean. You were their sanctuary, but they were never yours. They labeled it strength, as if calling it a gift excused the neglect. They applauded your balance without asking what it cost. What looked like endurance wasn't always choice, it was survival. What felt like resilience was just your silence learning to wear armor. Not because you wanted to be invincible, but because no one offered to help you breathe. But even steel can become sacred when forged in the right fire. And that's what they never saw. You weren't breaking down. You were building something they'd never be able to carry. It wasn't exile. It was alignment. Slowly, like dust slipping through the cracks of an old window, the people around you began to vanish. Not because you chased them away, but because the rhythm of your becoming no longer matched their silence. At first, the fractures were easy to read. The ones who always took more than they offered, the ones who wore kindness like a costume. But then came the quieter unravelings, those who once felt like home, now foreign, now fading. Their exits didn't come with blame, just the ache of realizing that loyalty and compatibility are not the same. Loss arrived in layers. Each goodbye carried the weight of a private funeral, not just for the relationship, but for the version of you that needed it. There was no roadmap through that ache, no clarity from within it. And yet, beyond the fog, an intricate sorting was unfolding. Something wiser than reason was drawing new blueprints. The space left behind wasn't empty. It was sacred ground being cleared for voices that wouldn't distort your truth to fit their comfort. What once felt like collapse was actually an unveiling. Bit by bit, your essence returned to itself. Not amplified, just finally unmuted. The filters they installed in your behavior, the brakes they put on your expression, all began to short-circuit. Not from effort, but from the rising current of something that could no longer be withheld. While you counted the absences, life was opening the gates. And what poured through was not a replacement for what left, it was the answer to why it had to. They watched closely, convinced you hadn't changed much. You still looked the same. You still smiled on cue. But something was missing, and not in the way they feared losing you, but in the way they could no longer use you. Their words landed, but found no reaction. Their old tricks hit nothing but space. Where there had once been a reliable pattern, the pleasing, the apologizing, the explaining, now there was only stillness. And that stillness terrified them more than any argument ever could. The version of you they'd come to depend on had vanished without warning, and they were left shadowboxing with a presence they couldn't hold. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't strategy. It was the natural consequence of your becoming. Something inside you simply refused to keep responding to what no longer resonated. Not out of anger, but from clarity. You didn't abandon the past. You outgrew its reach. The image they built of you, brick by brick, crumbled under the light of who you actually are. They speak to you now in familiar tones, but they feel the edge. Their comfort zone lost its script. And the emptiness they experience in your presence is not your absence, it's the absence of control. There comes a moment when their urgency reveals more than their silence ever did. Not the surface-level concern, not the check-ins or hollow compliments, but the subtle tremble in their voices when they sense you no longer orbit their needs. The surge in affection, the sudden generosity, the well-timed invitations, it's not about love. It's about dependency. They weren't nurturing you. They were sustaining themselves through proximity. What they once framed as your emotional hunger was often just their silent appetite wearing polite clothing. And then, something shifted. Your life began refining itself. The exits became more elegant. Connections started thinning not out of drama, but out of energetic misalignment. Even the kindest ones, those who seemed full of care, could no longer hide the invisible hooks tucked into their kindness. What remained wasn't emptiness. It was clarity. A precise rebalancing. A return to neutrality where only those rooted in reciprocity could remain. It didn't mean something was wrong with you. It meant something powerful was activating within you. That stretch of solitude you feared? It wasn't abandonment. It was insulation, sacred shielding from echoes that would have diluted your truth. What felt like being forgotten was actually divine discernment doing its quiet work. The space left behind was not a wound. It was preparation. A soul-shaped invitation for those who would recognize your depth without needing to diminish it. While the old world kept screaming about power, something softer, yet infinitely stronger, began forming in silence. It didn't fight to be noticed. It didn't announce itself. It simply was. A system built not on hierarchy, but on resonance. Where presence replaced performance. Where depth wasn't a threat, but an invitation. And those still clinging to control couldn't find the doorway in, because this wasn't built for control, it was built for alignment. In this space, truth didn't need convincing. It recognized itself instantly, in glances, in energy, in essence. There comes a point when vengeance becomes too small for you. When watching others stumble feels like a waste of altitude. You've ascended to altitudes where old games dissolve. Where their words bounce off the atmosphere and never reach you. They can't find you, not because you're hiding, but because they're searching with instruments that don't work in the dimension you now inhabit. Their tools are outdated. Their strategies, irrelevant. And you've become fluent in a frequency they never thought to study. This wasn't a reward for surviving. It wasn't a prize for suffering. It was a homecoming. You didn't earn access, you remembered your address. The terrain didn't change. You did. And with that remembrance, everything recalibrated. The noise of a lesser world faded beneath your feet, and what remained was the sound of something ancient and familiar. The resonance of being exactly where you were always meant to be. There was no grand announcement, no external validation. Just a quiet moment when you stopped seeking permission and began claiming space that was always coded with your name. Not by force, not with noise, but with clarity. What once felt like rebellion now felt like returning. You didn't win a prize, you reclaimed a position that had been waiting for you beneath layers of distortion. Every dismissal, every belittlement, every attempt to shrink you was simply friction forging your awareness. You were never meant to be small. You were only learning how to remember the scale of your essence. The framework around you shifted the moment you did. Systems that once rewarded imitation began collapsing under the weight of their own artificiality. The old scaffolding, propped up by control, performance, and illusion, couldn't hold in the presence of what's real. Suddenly, sincerity became strength. Clarity became currency. And in that new terrain, only those operating from the core of their truth could thrive. This wasn't an upgrade. It was a reset. One that honored coherence over control and depth over decoration. And the irony? They feared your silence more than your rage. Not because it was quiet, but because it was knowing. Deep down, they always sensed there was something about you they couldn't name but couldn't ignore. What they mistook for modesty was a concealed voltage. And when that current finally activated, it didn't need to retaliate, it simply rendered their tactics obsolete. What once felt like opposition was actually alignment in disguise, disguising the truth until you were finally strong enough to stand in it without needing to be seen. They thought they were tearing you down. But with every lie, every abandonment, every calculated wound. They were unknowingly sculpting the very shape that power would take in you. Not because they were wise, but because life used their misalignment as material. Without intending to, they helped burn away every mask, every attachment, every false version of you that could no longer survive in the space your truth was about to claim. They weren't your destroyers. They were your accelerators, and their resistance only sharpened your edge. What they called too much became the exact frequency the world needed. That deep perception they dismissed as fragility now slices through illusion with surgical clarity. The emotions they mocked became instruments of calibration. The quiet visions they scoffed at? Those were not delusions. They were maps. You were never broken. You were broadcasting on a level they couldn't comprehend, and now that your channel is clear, others are tuning in and finding their own reflection in your light. The era of self-sacrifice has closed its doors behind you. Not in bitterness, but in wisdom. That endless giving, the kind that left you dimmer each time, has been replaced by discernment. You've learned how to pour without emptying, how to care without being consumed. Your essence is no longer available to those who treat your presence like background light. And as your boundaries strengthened, the void left behind became their reckoning. Not because you punished them, but because the source they took for granted no longer bends to their hunger. There's no more chasing, no more contorting, no more overthinking. What you once begged for now shows up without being summoned, drawn to your presence like metal to magnet. Not because you're demanding, but because you're aligned. The moment you stopped apologizing for your essence, the entire structure of reality began shifting around it. Doors open not from force, but from recognition. Invitations find you mid-thought. Circumstances curve in your direction without needing to be bent. This isn't about strategy or visualization. It's the inevitable consequence of congruence. When you stopped treating your truth like a liability, the friction disappeared. What once blocked you now clears itself before you arrive. Because you no longer walk against the rhythm, you are the rhythm. Everything you touch now responds with fluidity, because your inner system is no longer arguing with itself. You've left behind the days of struggle marching through resistance. Now, momentum builds with every step, because you're no longer asking the world for permission to move. It sees you and responds, not as a request, but as a confirmation. The systems that once tried to limit you are folding in on themselves, not because you're attacking, but because their relevance evaporated in your wake. They cannot survive where integrity becomes standard. And the ones who clung to power by suppressing yours? They're unraveling under their own weight. You don't have to expose them. Their emptiness is doing the job. Without your energy to lean on, their scaffolding crumbles. Their borrowed confidence fades. And you, fully charged and fully seen, continue forward, not to punish, not to prove, but simply to build. Because true power doesn't retaliate. It radiates. And now, nothing inauthentic can stand in its path. There's a specific kind of chaos that erupts when people lose access to what they were never entitled to in the first place. You'll see it in the sudden flurry of attention, the frantic messages, the dramatic reappearances cloaked in urgency. Not because they've changed, but because the supply has vanished. Your silence has become their crisis. The warmth they once took for granted is now a cold absence echoing through their carefully crafted narratives. And in their confusion, they scramble, not to repair the bond, but to reattach to the source. They'll come dressed in soft words and downcast eyes, speaking in the dialect of regret. But something won't sit right. The timing too convenient. The stories too rehearsed. Behind the kindness is calculation. Behind the apology is appetite. What they want isn't connection, it's access. But this time, you're tuned to a different frequency. And their pitch doesn't match. Some will go further. They'll mirror your evolution, recite your truths, mimic your cadence. They'll wear the costume of awakening so well it almost passes. Almost. But intuition is an X-ray. And you've walked through too much fire not to recognize who carries the smoke. Real growth imprints differently. It doesn't need to announce itself. It's felt. The trickiest ones will try to rewrite history. They'll crown themselves architects of your journey, framing their neglect as guidance, their harm as lessons. They'll tell you they knew all along. But their need to be seen as essential is just a mask for panic, because deep down, they've realized something unbearable. Your story moved forward without them. Not in spite of them. Without them. And now they're trying to sneak into the credits of a film they never had the courage to watch unfold. While others wrestle with the noise of collapsing narratives, something ancient and intelligent is weaving its way through your very structure. It's not metaphorical, it's biological. Your system is syncing with truth on a level science hasn't yet found language for. Internal codes begin to reawaken. The architecture of who you are becomes more precise, more luminous. Circuits that once lay quiet now pulse with clarity. It's not a performance. It's an upgrade that no one gave you, because it was never theirs to give. What once felt like emotional fragility now operates like advanced instrumentation. You don't just pick up moods, you interpret them with clarity most can't imagine. You don't just hear people, you feel what they mean before they reach the end of the sentence. You're no longer reading the world with your eyes. You're decoding it with your frequency. Night no longer means escape. It becomes initiation. Dreams become more than reflections, they're transmissions. Lessons arrive without language. You wake up remembering truths you never studied. Ideas visit like old friends. What used to be dismissed as fantasy now feels more instructional than anything written down. Rest becomes less about recovery and more about download. Then comes the speech you didn't rehearse. The phrase that exits your mouth and changes someone else's life. Words emerge from beyond the mind, landing exactly where they're needed. You didn't prepare. You just allowed. People come closer, not because you've broadcast yourself, but because your presence makes something dormant inside them blink awake. And time. It's no longer a straight line. It bends, loops, weaves, waits. You feel memories of what hasn't happened. You know things without knowing how. The calendar loses meaning because you've slipped beneath it. And now, you live in the folds, where destiny doesn't arrive, it remembers. The conflict you've endured wasn't random or recent. It echoes from places beyond this lifetime, threads pulled tight across lifetimes where roles shifted but the soul lessons remained. The friction, the betrayals, the karmic loops, all part of a choreography far older than memory. Those who once felt like obstacles may have once been your catalysts in a different story. And now, as your awareness expands beyond this timeline, it all begins to make an eerie, sacred kind of sense. And then, someone appears. You don't need to ask where they've been. Your breath shifts, your system responds, and there's a stillness inside you that says, there you are. These aren't relationships built on shared hobbies or matching worldviews. This is soul-level resonance, the kind of recognition that bypasses logic entirely. There's no starting point because the bond was never severed. The reconnection happens not in the mind, but in the field where your codes already knew each other. You begin to notice a different language emerging, one made not of sound but of vibration. Sentences collapse into a single glance. Comfort arrives without a word. Ideas move from one heart to another without crossing the mouth. This isn't fantasy. It's ancient technology being reactivated in real time. You're no longer operating alone. You're a node in a living network, each person embodying a facet of the whole. One builds bridges to the unseen. Another translates soul into sound. Another shields the portal with quiet, unwavering presence. Together, you form a circuit so intelligent that the world around you starts to respond differently, as if reality itself is being rerouted through your shared field. And love. It no longer comes dressed in lessons or scarcity. It arrives with no agenda, no hunger, no mask. It doesn't fill your gaps, it expands your edges. It mirrors not your wounds, but your wholeness. You don't fear losing it because you no longer fear losing you. The people now walking beside you don't need saving. They bring maps. They don't drain you, they multiply you. And in their presence, the universe stops feeling like something you're navigating alone, and starts feeling like something you're co-authoring in real time. Without asking for permission, your external world begins to move in rhythm with who you've finally become on the inside. The work that once drained your spirit either elevates or evaporates. New paths arrive, not because you chased them, but because your energy became too precise to accommodate misalignment. Resources show up, not in response to hustle, but in response to clarity. You're no longer proving your worth, you're embodying it. And life responds accordingly. Where you live, how you rest, what surrounds you, it all starts to shift. Not from a place of status, but from vibration. Spaces that once felt fine now feel foreign. Rooms that once held your silence now echo with absence. You don't seek comfort, you seek resonance. And wherever you go, home follows, because home has become something you carry. What once felt like survival work, therapy, shadow dives, inner excavations, now reveals itself as preparation. What you once used to fix yourself now flows through you as medicine for others. You've become fluent in the language of transformation, not just as a student, but as a living archive of what's possible when someone refuses to break beneath the weight of what tried to shrink them.